They sat down at that long wooden table 9 times a season, every season, for 9 years, and then one by one, they simply stopped showing up. No goodbye scene could ever explain why. The cameras kept rolling on Walton's mountain long after the actors who built it had already begun walking away, and the reasons were far more human, far more painful, and far more complicated than anything the writers ever put on the page. For millions of viewers who tuned in every Thursday night starting in 1972, The Waltons wasn't just a television program. It was a ritual. It was the closest thing American broadcasting had to a warm hand on the shoulder during a decade that felt anything but gentle. Vietnam winding down, Watergate unraveling, a country exhausted and looking for something to believe in. Earl Hamner Jr., the show's creator, had lived through the Depression in rural Virginia, and he poured that memory into a semi-autobiographical family. John and Olivia Walton, their 7 children, and the grandparents who anchored them all under one roof in fictional Jefferson County. Hamner had already explored this world in his 1961 novel Spencer's Mountain and the 1963 film adaptation, but it was a television series developed with producer Lee Rich and based on Hamner's own 1971 TV movie The Homecoming that turned this quiet story into a cultural institution. And yet, behind that warm glow of lantern light and Hamner's own nostalgic narration, the people playing the Waltons were living lives that pulled harder and harder against the fiction. Marriages, ambitions, illness, blacklists, and mortality all found their way onto that mountain, whether the show wanted them to or not. To understand why so many of them left, some quietly, some suddenly, some never by choice at all, you have to look past the show's soft-focused nostalgia and into the real lives of the actors who made it feel so true. Start with Richard Thomas, the young man who was John Boy Walton, the eldest son whose diary entries and narration functioning as the emotional spine of the entire series. Thomas won an Emmy for the role in 1973, and for a while, he was the face of the show, the audience's surrogate into Hamner's own boyhood. But Thomas had never intended to be a television actor for the rest of his life. He had trained in the theater, studied at the neighborhood playhouse in New York, and always saw himself moving between stage and film work. By the time the show reached its 5th season in 1976 and 1977, Thomas was newly married with a growing family of his own. He and his first wife, Alma Gonzalez, welcomed triplets in 1975, and the grinding production schedule of a weekly hour-long drama was pulling him away from the very family life the show was supposed to celebrate. In interviews given years later, Thomas has spoken candidly about wanting to stretch as an actor, to avoid being permanently boxed into the role of the earnest, idealistic son, and pursue film roles that television simply couldn't offer him at the time. He departed after the 5th season, and the show made the unusual choice to recast John Boy rather than write him out entirely, bringing in actor Robert Whiteman for the 6th and 7th seasons. It was a decision that unsettled longtime viewers, who had spent 5 years watching one specific face grow into adulthood on their screens. Whiteman, for his part, has spoken about the difficulty of stepping into a role so closely identified with another actor, essentially performing under the shadow of a performance the audience had already fallen in love with. Thomas would eventually return for television reunion movies in the years that followed, suggesting that his departure was never about resentment toward the show itself, but about an actor recognizing a narrow window he had to build a broader career before the role calcified around him permanently. Then there is Michael Learned, whose portrayal of Olivia Walton earned her 3 Emmy Awards during the show's run, an extraordinary achievement for a role that, on paper, could have been reduced to nothing more than a stoic, self-sacrificing mother figure. Learn brought a quiet intensity to Olivia that made her far more than a background presence, and audiences responded to her deeply. But by the later seasons, Learn had grown restless. She has spoken in interviews, including conversations preserved by the Archive of American Television, about her ambivalence toward the character's saintly, endlessly patient nature, and about her hunger to play more psychologically complex women before she aged out of the opportunity to do so. The show's writers, aware of her desire to step back, made the unusual choice to write Olivia's departure into the storyline itself, giving the character tuberculosis, and sending her to a New Mexico sanatorium for an extended absence beginning in the show's 6th season. It was a narrative device that allowed Learn to reduce her presence gradually rather than vanish without explanation, and it reflected a level of care from Hamner and production team that few departing actors on other shows were ever given. Learn returned periodically before leaving more permanently, and she has since built a substantial career in theater and television, including an Emmy-nominated run on the medical drama Nurse. Her exit from Walton's Mountain wasn't a rejection of the show's legacy. It was an actor who had given 3 extraordinary seasons of work and simply needed room to become someone else on screen. The departures that carried the heaviest emotional weight, though, were not choices at all. They were losses. Geer, who played the family's beloved patriarch grandpa Zebulon Walton, brought to the role a lifetime of hard-won wisdom that came from far outside the world of acting. Long before the Waltons, Geer had been a botanist, a labor organizer, and a close friend of Woody Guthrie, and during the 1950s he had been blacklisted in Hollywood after refusing to cooperate with the House Un-American Activities Committee, a period that cost him nearly a decade of steady screen work. That history gave a portrayal of Grandpa Walton a lived-in authenticity no script could manufacture. This was a man who understood hardship, principle, and the cost of standing by your convictions, and it showed in every scene he played. Geer continued working on the show even as his health declined, and in April of 1978, he died of respiratory failure at the age of 76. The production made a decision to write his death into the show's mythology rather than simply recasting or ignoring it, airing an episode that addressed Grandpa's passing with the same unhurried tenderness the series had always applied to loss. For a program built on the comforting illusion that families endure everything together, Geer's death was a genuine rupture, proof that the mountain could not, in the end, protect anyone from time. Ellen Corby, who played Grandma Esther Walton opposite Geer, endured her own devastating interruption. In 1976, midway through the show's run, Corby suffered a serious stroke that left her with slurred speech and partial paralysis, forcing her off the show entirely for a significant stretch. For many actresses in her position, that would have been the end of the role, quietly and permanently. But Corby fought to come back, undergoing extensive rehabilitation, and when she did return, the writers again chose honesty over convenient fiction, having Grandma's character suffer a stroke as well and slowly recover on screen, mirroring Corby's real physical journey in front of the same audience that had watched her disappear. It was an extraordinary, almost radical act of transparency for a network drama of that era, and Corby's willingness to let her illness become part of the character's story rather than hiding it added a layer of raw humanity to a show already built on sincerity. She continued appearing on the series with reduced mobility until Geer's death in 1978, after which she largely stepped back from the role, appearing less frequently as her own health made the demanding production schedule increasingly difficult to sustain. Ralph Waite, who anchored the show as the steady, hard-working patriarch John Walton, stayed with the series for most of the original run, but his relationship to the role was never uncomplicated either. Waite had ambitions as a director and had struggled for years with alcoholism before finding sobriety, a battle he spoke about openly later in life. He directed several episodes of the show himself, using the platform not just to perform but to shape the storytelling from behind the camera, and by the final seasons he was pursuing other outlets for that ambition, including stage work and directing projects outside the Walton universe. Waite would later become deeply involved in humanitarian work and even ran for Congress multiple times in California, reflecting a man whose sense of purpose always extended well past any single acting role, however beloved. His character was written out for stretches during the final season, explained within the story as John Walton working overseas, a narrative solution that gave Waite room to explore other projects without permanently closing the door on Walton's Mountain, and he did return for the show's later reunion films. What becomes clear, when you line up these departures side by side, is that The Waltons was never protected from the realities it was designed to soothe. The show's entire emotional appeal rested on the idea of a family that could weather anything, poverty, war, illness, grief, and remain intact around that dinner table. But the actors playing that family were not immune to any of it. Richard Thomas needed to grow as an artist and as a young father. Michael learned needed roles that didn't require her to be endlessly virtuous. Geer's body finally gave out after a lifetime of principled struggle. Ellen Corby fought to reclaim a role that a stroke had nearly taken from her. Ralph Waite carried ambitions and personal battles that stretched far beyond Jefferson County. Even Earl Hammer Jr. himself, The voice narrating every episode as the adult John Boy was drawing directly from his own family's real losses and real distances, meaning the show's fictional mountain was built brick by brick from actual grief. Biographers and television historians who have revisited the series in the decades since, including retrospectives built around interviews with surviving cast members and Hamner's own reflections before his death in 2016, have consistently pointed to the same truth. The reason the Waltons has endured so powerfully in American memory isn't because it depicted a family untouched by hardship, but because the people making it were quietly living through hardships of their own, and something of that truth leaked into every frame. Audiences may not have known in real time that Grandma's stroke on screen mirrored Ellen Corby's stroke off screen, or that John Boy's new face in Season 6 was a result of a young actor trying to protect his own future, but they felt the weight of it anyway, in the way certain episodes seem to ache a little more than others. There is something quietly devastating about a show built to comfort a nation turning out to be, behind the scenes, a story about people trying to hold themselves together while everything around them changed. The Waltons taught its audience that love doesn't mean nothing bad ever happens to a family. It means a family keeps setting a place at the table anyway. It turns out that lesson wasn't just written into the scripts. It was lived in real time by the very people delivering those lines, long after the cameras stopped rolling and long after some of them had already said their final goodnight from that mountain.